Hello, and welcome to the Mathematicians Podcast, the podcast where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we're diving into the life and work of Philo of Byzantium, an ancient Greek polymath who, despite living over 2,000 years ago, still manages to surprise us with his ingenuity. Now, if you've been following along, you'll know we've already covered the heavy hitters of Euclid with his elements, and Archimedes with his obsession with circles, and even Aristotle with his logic. Philo of Byzantium doesn't quite enjoy the same level of mathematical superstardom, but what he lacks in fame, he makes up in sheer variety. He wasn't solely a mathematician, he was an engineer, a physicist, and perhaps even an amateur magician, if you count automatic wine dispensers as magic. And if you don't count those as magic, pour yourself a drink, you're going to need it. But I used to have a friend called Oliver who was a street urchin. He was born an urchin and he would die an urchin, or at least that was the story he was always told. He was orphaned at birth by a family unable to provide him a home. Completely powerless, he was sent off to the workhouses, and he earned his meals by turning a great wheel by climbing the steps carved into the outside. An existence like a human-sized hamster, but he always yearned for more. Due to some irregularities with behaviour, he was sold off to become an apprentice to a mortuarist, although was shortly sacked and left to fend for himself. Taken in by a lovable but broadly abusive guardian, he made his way as part of a pickpocketing gang. At each development of his career, his level of agency and power was being transformed. In the workhouse, he was the driver of the great wheel. For the mortuarist, he led the funeral marches, clearing the crowds from the street. And for the pickpocketer, he owned the streets and helped himself to the spoils. And yet, in a different way, he was completely at the whims of fate, with no choice about what came next. If you'd asked him at the time, when he was 11 or so, he would have told you that his life had reached its theatrical conclusion when he was taken in by a loving middle-class family and given a stable home. Sometimes all it takes is one or two heartfelt songs to make your life feel complete. But as he grew up, he still yearned for more agency, more power. Later, he took out a bank loan and bought the workhouse that had fed him as a boy. He looked at the orphans, still operating the orphan-crushing machine, and dreamed of a world where their lives were different. And the big wheel turned. What he had now learned is that the wheel, driven by the orphans, was connected to the textile mill next door, the multitude of little legs powering the loom that clothed the rich and the elite of the city. And the big wheel turned. He made himself a cup of tea, noticing the way the lid of the kettle jumped and danced as the pot hung over the fire in his study. He thought to himself, there's power in that steam. And the big wheel turned. Over the next few years, he had built a very large kettle, 500 gallons, and hung it over a great fire in the middle of the orphanage. By now, there were no orphans left, as he'd been forgetting to feed them whilst he built his contraption. On the final day of construction, he filled the kettle, lit the fire, and directed the steam towards the big wheel. But the big wheel did not turn. The problem here is that there must be a transfer from the oscillating lateral motion of the kettle lid to the rotational action of the wheel. I told him, it requires a twist, Oliver. So who was Philo of Byzantium, and why should we care? Well, for one, he gives us a unique glimpse into the scientific world of the Hellenistic period, a time when maths wasn't just about proofs, but also about building machines that could shoot arrows, lift heavy weights, and apparently improve your dinner parties. So let's dive in, starting with the man himself. Philo of Byzantium lived sometime between 280 BCE and 220. As his name suggests, he hailed from Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul. This put him as the crossroads of cultures, Greek intellectual traditions mingling with Eastern influences and the early stirrings of the Roman engineering prowess. Philo was less philosopher and more practical. He was part of a broader intellectual tradition centred around the Library of Alexandria. We're talking about one of the greatest hubs of knowledge in the ancient world. Imagine a place where scholars from all over the Mediterranean gathered to argue about geometry, write down their discovers, and, if legend is to be believed, occasionally set things on fire with giant parabolic mirrors. Philo's interests were vast. His writings cover everything from mechanics to mathematics to pneumatics. Think ancient hydraulics. He even ventured into automata, machines that seem to move by themselves. And if that doesn't scream mad scientist, I don't know what does. But the real treasure trove in his work is Mechanica. It's a multi-volume masterpiece covering everything from levers and pulleys to siege weapons. Just think about asking the same guy to both build a catapult and fix your plumbing. Now you might be thinking, sure, he built some gadgets, but what about the maths? Oh, don't worry, we're getting there. Because lurking beneath his mechanical inventions is a fascinating web of mathematical thought. At the heart of Philo's mathematical work lies a profound interest in applied geometry. If Euclid gave us the theatrical framework, Philo showed us how to turn it into a working machine. Let's start with one of his favourite topics, levers. Archimedes famously said, "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the earth." Philo, he wrote the instruction manual. Philo's treatment of levers and pulleys was built on geometric reasoning. He systematically explored how mechanical advantage arises through the relationship between lengths and forces. If you've ever used a crowbar to pry something open, you'll have noticed that the force exerted is proportional to the force applied times the length of the handle. This is Philo's principles. Congratulations, you're part of an ancient mathematical legacy. Although he didn't open boxes, he calculated how to optimise leverage for building everything from cranes to weapons. And speaking of weapons, Philo didn't write his books for his nerdy friends. He had a very practical audience in mind. Military engineers. They tended to pay better, both then and now. His work on catapults and ballistae were battlefield ready, not just theoretical. Take the torsion catapult, for instance. This device relied on twisted ropes to store potential energy, which is then released to launch projectiles. Philo provided detailed instructions on how to calculate the correct arm length, tension, and angle for maximum range. The maths here is fascinating. Essentially, he was modelling rotational energy and its conversion into linear motions. In modern terms, we'd call this a study in energy transfer and elasticity. For Philo, these calculations had life and death consequences. Build your catapult wrong, and you're not holding boulders at the enemy, you're giving them a very entertaining show. Usually, when building a weapon, someone dies. The goal is to make it not you. Part of his great mathematical contribution was the movement from prototype to final product. He asked himself, if this catapult can launch a stone that far, what would be required to launch a stone of twice the size? Curiously enough, this problem is analogous to that age-old challenge of doubling the cube. And his solution involved the intersection of a hyperbola and a circle, preempting Heron's very similar solution by a few hundred years. The geometric reasoning behind these devices relied heavily on trigonometry, though not in the formalised sense we use today. Philo worked with proportions, ratios of lengths. That allowed him to scale his designs up or down. After all, what is trigonometry, if not the measurement of ratio between sides of similar shapes? Among Philo's contributions to military engineering was a mechanism that sounds like something out of a modern action film, the repeating crossbow. In a time when most weapons fired one shot and then paused for laborious reload, Philo's design aimed for continuity. One motion, multiple shots. Less like a bow, more like a machine. The device used a clever combination of a hopper to hold multiple bolts, a sliding mechanism to draw and release the string, and a self-resetting system to prepare the next shot. The soldier would operate a single lever that with each stroke drew the string, loaded the bolt, fired, and then reset. No need to fumble with arrows or haul back on a cord, just pump, aim, and repeat. While similar designs are sometimes credited to Chinese inventors like Zhuangliang centuries later, Philo's concept shows that the idea of automated firepower was already alive in the Greek imagination. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about efficiency, about transforming force into rhythm. Now let's talk about Philo's more whimsical side, in his treatise on pneumatica. He described a range of devices powered by air pressure and vacuum effects. Some of these were practical, like water pumps, but others were frankly delightful. One of his most famous inventions, an automatic wine pourer. Using air pressure, the device could dispense wine when you placed a cup beneath it. In a world without electricity, this must have felt like sorcery, or at the very least, a great way to show off at dinner. It worked through a carefully balanced system of air pressure and siphons. Imagine a hollow statuette holding a jug. Inside the statue, there is a hidden reservoir of liquid and a set of tubes connected to a cup. When you place the cup on a specific platform, its weight triggers a valve, allowing air to enter the reservoir, and that air pressure forces the wine to rise through a siphon and into the cup. No hands required. Remove the cup and the flow stops. It's precise, repeatable, and just mysterious enough to impress a dinner guest, or, say, a minor deity. From a mathematical perspective, Philo was working with fluid dynamics, long before the field even had a name. He intuitively understood the relationship between pressure, volume, and flow rates, principles that now form the basis of modern hydraulics. Let's talk about something subtle: heat. Not fire, not flame, but the invisible creep of warmth and chill. The way air feels heavy on some days and sharp on others. In the ancient world, people were very good at noticing temperature, but not so good at measuring it. That would change, just a little, with the invention of the thermoscope. Philo of Byzantium is sometimes credited with one of the earliest forms of this device, a precursor to the thermometer. Though it didn't have a scale, and certainly didn't offer a number you could jot down in a lab notebook, the idea was simple. Take a sealed glass or metal bulb connected to a narrow vertical tube and partially filled with liquid, usually water, sometimes coloured for dramatic effect. As the air inside the bulb heats up, it expands, pushing the liquid column down. Cool the air and the liquid rises back up. No mercury, no Fahrenheit, just motion, and the beginnings of measurable heat. We don't know exactly what Philo used to build it. Glass blowing in his time was rudimentary, so it's likely the device involved metal tubing, a hollow sphere of bronze or copper, and perhaps a basin of water or wine to act as the indicator. It wouldn't have been terribly precise, but that wasn't the point. The thermoscope didn't quantify temperature, it demonstrated it. It made heat visible, gave it shape, let it move. And this is no trivial thing. Temperature was still mostly described in terms of humours and metaphors. It's hot and dry or cold and moist. The balance of blood and bile. Philo's thermoscope was quietly revolutionary. It suggested that heat was not just a mood of the air or a disposition of the gods. It was a force, and one that could be tracked. Of course, it would take over a millennium before anyone thought to slap a number on it. Galileo would refine the thermoscope in the 17th century, and then, inevitably, Isaac Newton would show up and do something incredibly British with it. That is, invent his own temperature scale that started at 0, the freezing point of water, and moved to 1, the temperature of a man's armpit. Yes, you heard that right. Newton's original unit of heat was the pit. Charming and completely unusable. Philo, for his part, didn't need numbers to know that heat mattered. He just needed a column of liquid, a sealed sphere, and an idea that temperature, like pressure or time, could be tamed, not by mysticism, but by mechanism. Let's take a little detour into something stranger and maybe even a little magical. You see, among Philo's many fascinations, one of the most curious was his work on automata. These were mechanical devices designed to mimic life. Birds that sang, statues that moved, and temple doors that opened by themselves when you lit a fire on the altar. If that sounds suspiciously like divine intervention, well, that's kind of the point. These weren't clever party tricks. In the Hellenistic world, temples were more than places of worship. They were stages, and the gods needed good stagecraft. Philo's mechanisms helped blur the lines between natural law and divine will. A temple that opens its own doors, that's not convenience, it's theatre, it's technology, and it's theology, all at once. Technically speaking, these automata were powered by water pressure, siphons, counterweights, and cleverly hidden levers. But what makes them remarkable, what still gives them a pulse today, is the philosophical underpinning. Philo wasn't only trying to build machines, he was trying to replicate intention, a lifeless object that responds to your presence. That's not far off from the earliest dreams of artificial intelligence. Of course, we have no surviving prototypes, and much of what we know comes from later interpretations. But the idea that you could encode behaviour, predictable, repeatable behaviour, into a machine, well, that's a profound notion. It turns motion into something more than just physics. It becomes performance. And let's not kid ourselves. Modern robotics owes more than a passing nod to Philo and his contemporaries. Every automated door you walk through, every animatronic dinosaur at a museum, every ventriloquist dummy that blinks at just the right time, that's Philo's ghost, still turning gears in the background. So before we write him off as just a builder of bridges and siege engines, let's remember, Philo also built illusions, and in doing so, he asked one of the oldest human questions, with a new mechanical flair. What does it mean to move like a living thing? Now, if you thought wine-pouring statues were impressive, let's shift gears to something a little quieter, yet just as powerful: writing. Philo wasn't only mechanical, he also thought deeply about communication. In fact, he spent time studying the machines of letters. Not just the ones that you send, but the very shape of letters themselves, how they're formed and how they might be inscribed or encoded, how information could be concealed or embedded through mechanical means. This intersects intriguingly with military engineering, where secret messages could be hidden in the movements of gears or revealed only under certain conditions. Imagine a locked mechanism that displays a letter only when a sequence of dials is turned just right, part encryption and part puzzle box. What's remarkable is how fluidly Philo moved between the physical and the abstract. To him, a letter wasn't just ink on papyrus, it was a kind of force, something that could be shaped, transmitted, stored, and even performed by a machine. In that way, he was perhaps one of the earliest thinkers to imagine information not as a message, but as a mechanism. Today, we store words in silicon chips and transmit them through fibre optic cables, but the basic dream hasn't changed: to make meaning move automatically. So far, we've talked about machines that pore, mimic, and even talk, but what about the machines that hold steady? Now that seems less glamorous, until you realise just how difficult it is to keep something level in a world that constantly moves. Philo is credited with one of the earliest known descriptions of what we now call a gimbal, a system of concentric rings that allows an object, like a bowl or a compass, to remain level regardless of the orientation of its base. Imagine suspending a cup inside a series of frames that pivot at right angles to one another. Tilt the outer frame, twist the base, shake the whole apparatus, and the cup inside stays upright, as if ignoring the chaos around it. It's a small miracle of balance, engineered serenity. In practical terms, it meant liquids could stay level on unstable platforms like ships or carts. But symbolically, it's fascinating. A device that isolates inner calm from outer turbulence. Philosophers would later describe the gimbal as a metaphor for the soul, suspended, surrounded, but undisturbed. Philo likely used it for practical demonstrations, involving an ink reservoir or a water clock. But whether he realised it or not, he had laid the foundation for centuries of invention, from maritime compasses to spacecraft gyroscopes. It's one of those rare cases where a device for stillness quietly set the world in motion. So why does Philo still matter today? Well, first, his work bridges the gap between pure mathematics and engineering. While thinkers like Euclid focused on axioms and proofs, Philo showed how those abstract principles could be transformed into working machines. This dual focus on both theory and application foreshadows the modern disciplines of applied mathematics and mechanical engineering. Second, his systematic treatment of mechanical advantage laid the groundwork for later studies in statics and dynamics. When you solve physics problems using Newton's laws, you're standing on Philo's shoulders, though hopefully without a catapult involved. Finally, his exploration of pneumatics anticipated modern studies of fluid mechanics. Every time you fill up your car's tyres or marvel at a hydraulic lift, you owe a small debt to Philo's curiosity. Philo's influence lingers in ways both practical and profound. He reminds us that mathematics is a toolbox to reshape the physical world, but also an invitation to pick up those tools and use them. You might call him a traitor to mathematics by turning his skill as an engineer into crafting weapons of war, and I would agree. But if we're honest, much of the modern world would not have existed if it were not for Philo's mechanical advantage. And if anyone asks, yes, it's all Philo's fault. And that's it for today. Join me next time on the Mathematicians podcast, where we will be talking about Eratosthenes, and I will sieve you there. If you can't wait to hear from me between now and next week, then you can follow me on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod, where every now and then I will share something cool that I've found. Alternatively, if you would like to hear my voice talking about maths more, you can check out a new project I've started on YouTube, a chat show about maths. So far, episodes 1 and 2 have been published, which are all about the numbers, 1 and 2. Search for @unnaturalnumbers, that's un-natural numbers. Until then, goodbye. The music today is Dance Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.